My Life and My Efforts, Volume 1. Autobiography by Karl May, 1842–1912. Karl May, born in 1842 under the name Carl Friedrich May, published the first volume of his autobiography in November of 1910. He never found the time to write the planned second volume, or any of the other future works he is referring to in this book before he died in 1912. Rudolf Lebbeus felt insulted by what Karl May had to say about him in his autobiography, and, less than 1 month after the sale of this book had started, Lebbeus succeeded in obtaining an injunction against it, so that it had to be taken out of the shops, and all remaining copies had to be destroyed. Rudolf Lebbeus is portrayed by Karl May as a villain of the worst kind, a man who changes his political loyalties for money and specializes in blackmailing people after digging up dirt from their past, in order to control and use them, and, most of all, in order to extort money. It is a fact that Lebbeus had been asking Karl May to loan him money, and when Karl May refused to pay, Lebbeus started publishing ever more aggressive articles against May in a newspaper he owned, full of exaggerated and partially false accusations. Lebbeus had been working for several newspapers with different political backgrounds before joining the Social Democratic Party and writing for their newspapers. After founding his own newspaper, he left the party and changed his political views into the very opposite. Lebbeus then focused on anti-Semitic propaganda, and, after the First World War, he even led an anti-Semitic party for a few years. He died in 1946. Thus, the first edition of Karl May's autobiography could only reach a few hundred people, probably mostly among German-speaking readers outside of Germany, for example, in Austria, where the injunction of the German court did not apply. About 3 months prior to his death, Karl May wrote to his publisher, concerning My Life and My Efforts, I am willing to do your bidding. I will tackle it. Whether Karl May rewrote some parts of his autobiography is uncertain, but very soon after his death, his publisher announced that an abridged version would soon be available. For a month after Karl May's death, this abridged version was published. It did not just omit the passages about Rudolf Lebbeus, but much more, and it even added text taken from other autobiographical writings by Karl May. This adaptation is credited to Karl May's widow, and E. Schmid, 1880 for 1951. Little more than a month had passed before someone else, the lawyer Oscar Gerlich, felt insulted by this version and obtained an injunction against its publication. The publisher reacted by printing new, mostly blank, versions of those 2 pages Gerlich had objected against, instructing booksellers to rip out the offending pages and to glue the new ones in. In December of 1912, the lawsuit was settled, and the remaining copies of the adaptation could be sold with all of its pages. But a new edition would have to be changed. This third, further abridged edition was published in 1914 by E. Schmid. In early 1917, a 34th volume was added to the series of Karl May's collected works, of which 33 volumes had been published in the author's lifetime. This 34th volume is titled I. It contains another abridged version of the autobiography as well as a few other texts, mostly about, but not by, Karl May. By 1995, this book had gone through 39 editions, in which the text of the autobiography had again been revised several times, though the later revisions aimed at a partial restoration of the original text. The compilation of other texts contained in this volume also differs in the various editions. Even the edition of 1995 still omits a large passage, at least 36 pages in the first edition, about Rudolf Lebbeus. It also moves to passages which had been omitted from the 7th chapter in previous editions to an appendix. In the first one of these passages, Karl May writes about his views on plagiarism. Though Karl May insists on being truthful in this book, one should not approach it without skepticism. It is particularly hard to believe that all of his repeated deceptions, assuring his readers that his fictional adventure stories were based on fact, were all just designed to set the scene for some great work he was all the time planning to write at some later point in his life. Probably, his mind just sought a way to escape his unpleasant past and his present problems with his failing marriage to his first wife, by retreating into the fictional persona of the protagonist of his novels. Furthermore, there are many details where May's memory might have proven slightly unreliable or which he might intentionally or subconsciously try to conceal. For instance, his description of the events due to which he was thrown out of the boarding school completely contradicts the version found in the school's files. He writes that before Christmas he had to clean the candlesticks, and kept the tallow he scratched off of them, to make small candles from it, to be used as Christmas decorations. He was watched by a fellow student, who reported this theft of what Karl May regarded as garbage to the principal. According to the school's files, it happened like this. In November, Karl May had to clean the candlesticks and to replace the burnt-down candles. 2 weeks later, 2 older students found 6 complete candles in his unlocked suitcase. They turned them over to the student, who was in charge of the candles for that week, but agreed not to tell the teachers. Shortly before Christmas, accusations are made that, at 2 occasions, money had been stolen. The students who had found the candles came forward, and were reprimanded by the teachers for having covered the matter up before. The question of the stolen money was never resolved. Also, everything Karl May tells us about the life of his father's mother before he was even born is very questionable. It would seem that this grandmother was not just a gifted storyteller, but might also have invented a more romantic past for herself, which she then passed off as the truth to her family, just as Karl May later also pretended that his fictional novels were true. Karl May writes that this grandmother lost her mother at an early age. She fell in love with his grandfather, but felt obliged to devote all of her energy to taking care of her ailing father. Thus, she kept her faithful lover waiting until her father had died. After giving birth to 2 children, she lost her husband in a tragic and rather dramatic accident at Christmas. After some hard times, she found a job as a housekeeper, had a near-death experience, lost her job, and married a poor weaver by the name of Vogel, who also died shortly afterwards. Some aspects of this story plainly contradict the few facts from her life which could be pieced together from old church documents. These facts are: on May 1st, 1803, she married C.F. May, while both of her parents were still alive. 5 months later, their daughter was born. In 1810, her son Heinrich, Karl May's father, was born. The records of his baptism state that Heinrich's father was not his mother's husband. He was baptized under his mother's maiden name. On February 4th, 1818, C.F. May died due to a disorderly way of life, whatever this is supposed to mean. In 1820, the mother of Karl May's grandmother died. In 1822, she married C.T. Vogel. In 1825, her father died. In 1826, C.T. Vogel died. Later in the same year, a church document lists her son Heinrich with the surname May. There are indications that Karl May was not just aware of the fact that some things he wrote about his grandmother were not literally true, but that he had also invented some of it himself. The most striking indication of this is an old book of Oriental myths, entitled Der Hakawati, which May claims had belonged to his grandmother. He claims that the fable of Sitara, which he tells us in the beginning of his autobiography, had been contained in this book. It seems that neither such a book, nor the author Christianus Kretman ever existed. The author's name is strangely similar to May's grandmother's maiden name J. Christiane Kretschmer. The fable of Sitara seems to be Karl May's own creation. In the end of the 5th chapter, he mentions another book, which he claims he had received from a man who had a great impact on his life while he was in prison. This book also never really existed. Apparently, these books are only meant to serve as symbols for abstract concepts and ideas, which he got to know through the persons concerned. Thus, not just Karl May's novels, but also his autobiography, would have to be interpreted in a somewhat allegorical way, not necessarily representing literally true facts, but rather symbolizing a spiritual truth. Karl May's grandmother is of particular interest, because he writes that she had inspired the character of the Princess Mara Durrama, whom May regarded as the female counterpart, in the Orient to the Indian chief Wintu in America. Wintu is the title character of Karl May's most famous novel, and also appears in several others of his books. But Karl May never wrote the planned novel about Mara Durrama, which he had intended to cover 3 or 4 volumes, just like Wintu. Thus, Mara Durrama only plays a comparatively smaller role in his existing novels, and we can only guess how he planned to develop this character into the central character of his later, unwritten works. Though the 5th chapter, relating the darkest part of Karl May's life, is the longest in the book, it still skips many things, which the author obviously does not want to remember. Thus, the question which crimes he had actually committed remains largely unanswered. He also does not tell us anything about the journeys he claims to have taken in those days, promising to disclose this in the 2nd volume, which he never wrote. The rumors he fostered that he had already in this early part of his life traveled to the Orient and to America are definitely not true. He probably never left Germany at this time. Only in his later years, he took a long trip to the Orient and Asia, 1899-1900, and a trip to America, 1908. As far as the lawsuits and the events which led up to them are concerned, Karl May, of course, cannot be expected to relate them in an objective manner. After he had resigned his job at HGMNCHMEYERS Publishing Company in 1877, he wrote for other publishers and got married in 1880. From 1882 on, we find him working for MNCHMEYER again, writing those novels which were to become the reason for his first lawsuit. According to Karl May, MNCHMEYER was on the verge of bankruptcy and begged May to save him with his gift for writing best-selling novels. But the truth might have been rather different. Karl May admits himself that the other publisher he had mainly been working for did not pay him much. The royalties I received from Pustet were so insignificant that I cannot bring myself to naming the amount. Having to support a wife, one can easily imagine that May was the one who was in need of some cash. Furthermore, I have read elsewhere that MNCHMEYER had paid May an advance of 500 marks, a fact which May fails to mention in his autobiography. And then there are Karl May's allegations that MNCHMEYER, or rather one of employees, had spiced up those novels with indecent passages, though it is likely that some abridgment had taken place. The claim that those novels were completely rewritten from morally impeccable stories into immoral trash are surely an exaggeration. For almost 20 years after their original publication, nobody seemed to be offended by these so-called indecent novels. Only after MNCHMEYER's widow had sold the rights to these novels, which she did not even own, and was therefore sued by Karl May, articles started appearing in the newspapers denouncing these novels as highly immoral. These articles were not just designed to destroy Karl May's reputation, and thereby ruin his chances in the pending lawsuits. They also increased the demand for the illegally printed copies of these novels. Perhaps, Karl May saw no other way to escape this trap than to pretend that his novels had been altered, and perhaps, his memory of them had also changed, regarding them as closer to his later works than they really were. At any rate, a proof, one way or the other, would be impossible. The original manuscripts had been destroyed, and those who allegedly rewrote these novels were already dead when the lawsuit started. After Karl May's death, Schmidt obtained the rights to all of his works. He believed in the myth that Karl May's novels had been thoroughly rewritten without the author's consent, and made sure that the original versions were no longer published. He then created what he regarded as improved versions of all of Karl May's works, especially the disputed novels. Originally published by MNCHMEYER, were rewritten rather dramatically. Large parts of the plot were removed, and new solutions to certain mysteries were invented. Characters from Karl May's more popular novels were added, etc. Generations of readers have known Karl May only through Schmidt's adaptations. After Karl May's works had entered the public domain, a few editions presenting the original text have been published, but the vast majority of all books sold in Germany under the name of Karl May still contains the adaptations by Schmidt et al. I have read that Karl May was the most frequently translated German author of all times, but unfortunately this does not apply to the English language. Though even the Encyclopedia Britannica describes him as one of the world's all-time fiction bestsellers, he is virtually unknown by most English-speaking readers. The earliest English translation of one of his works came in 1886, probably in the form of a weekly series of booklets, under the title Rosita, a translation of Das WLD or SCHEN. The first one of those disputed novels Karl May had written for HGMNCHMEYER under a pseudonym, I suppose. These booklets were just as quickly discarded and forgotten as they were printed. In 1898, two books entitled Wind 2, The Apache Night, and The Treasure of Nugget Mountain were published, containing a severely abridged and altered translation by Marion Ames Taggart of Karl May's most famous novel, Wind 2. Among other things, the main character is changed from a German, implicitly a Protestant, into an American, whom the translator has named Jack Hildreth, and who keeps on emphasizing that he was a Catholic. In one place, the translator has even added a line in which the hero is made to point out that the religion of the murderer Rattler was not his own, but that of a non-Catholic, when Winter suggests to him that he had the same religion as the murderer. In the original book, the hero simply answers yes and then goes on to explain, as he also does in the translation, that the murderer did not keep the commandments. These liberties of the translation are particularly serious since Karl May often had to defend himself against allegations of promoting Catholicism, though being a Protestant, just because he published many of his stories in a Catholic magazine. In 1900, the series of translations by M.L. Taggart was continued with Jack Hildreth on the Nile, based on Karl May's Der Mahdi, Achaia, Im Land des Mahdi. You can find these three books on the internet at http:// KRLMAY.UNI-BIELEFELD.DE, KMG, Sprken, English, Primlit, Index.htm.